The steward's hand closed on Wren's wrist before she'd set down the last trencher. "Up," old Corin said, not looking at her, already turning back to the dais. "Lord Hale's men want a song you'll do." She could have told him she hadn't sung since her mother died, that her voice these days came out of her like a hinge that wanted oil. She didn't waste the breath. 6 years scrubbing pots at Ashcombe Hold had taught her that arguing with Corin only bought her a longer night. The hall was loud with harvest feast noise, trestle tables groaning under salt cod and black bread, the Graymore men laughing too hard at their own jokes the way visiting men always did, testing how far a host's floor would let them go. I sat at the high table with my storm mark aching under my collar for the 9th night running, half listening to Lord Hale's endless account of his crossing, and I did not look up when Corin pushed the kitchen girl toward the dais steps. Servants sang at feasts. It was nothing. "A song for our guests," Corin announced, and there was a shape to his voice I should have caught, the particular relish men like him kept for small cruelties they could call hospitality. "Wren here has a rare gift. Don't you, girl?" Someone at the Graymore table laughed before she'd even opened her mouth. That was the joke. I understood a breath too late, not that she'd sing badly, but that she'd be made to try in front of men who'd already decided to laugh. She stood at the edge of the dais in her kitchen dress with a soot smear along one forearm she hadn't had time to scrub off, and for one long moment she didn't move at all. I watched her weigh it, refuse and be dragged, or stand there and be mocked, or sing. She chose to sing. Not loud, not the bright drinking song Corin had plainly wanted, something to be laughed through. She started low, in the old coast dialect the harvest crews used when they hauled nets at first light, a work song with no drama in it at all, just the rhythm of rope through a caller's hands. Her voice was rough at the edges the way a voice gets from years of wood smoke and cold water. 2 of the Graymore men grinned at each other. One began, softly, mockingly, to hum along off-key. I don't know exactly when I stopped hearing the hall. My storm mark sits over my collarbone, a crescent scar pale as bone that every Asheville king before me has carried, and it had burned for 9 nights. A slow, grinding heat that meant the coast was building toward something ugly, a storm my huntmaster couldn't read and my sea wolves wouldn't stop pacing for. I had grown so used to the ache I'd stopped noticing it as separate from my own pulse. Somewhere in the second verse of that plain, unlovely work song, it went quiet. Not faded, quiet the way a held breath finally lets go. I put my hand to my collar before I'd decided to. Across the hall, Corin was still smiling his small, cruel smile, and the Graymore men were still smirking, and none of them had felt it, because none of them carried the mark. But I felt the whole restless week in my chest simply stop. Listening, if a scar can listen. Outside the shuttered windows, faint under the noise of the hall, I heard the sea wolves. They had been howling every night for 9 days, an unbroken, ragged, worried sound that had every hunter in Ashcombe on edge, because sea wolves don't howl like that unless the tide itself is wrong. I heard it change. Not stop. Wolves don't simply stop, but soften, the ragged edge going out of it, 40 voices settling toward something almost like song of their own, answering hers through stone and shutter. Wren didn't know. She was looking at the rushes on the floor, 3 feet in front of her own boots, singing a net hauler's song to men who wanted her to fail, and she had no idea that on the other side of the wall my pack was going quiet for the first time in 9 nights, or that the king they served had gone still as carved wood at the high table. "That's enough," Corin said, when she reached the end of the second verse, in the flat voice of a man closing a joke he considered spent. "Back to the kitchens." I stood up. I want to say I did it with more grace than I did. I know I put my palm flat on the table hard enough that the cups jumped, and I know the hall went silent in the particular way. A room goes silent when the man who owns it is no longer pretending to enjoy himself. And I know Lord Hale's smile died on his face by degrees, the way a man's smile dies when he's trying to work out whether he's caused offense and hasn't yet found the shape of it. "Sing the rest," I said. Corin blinked at me. My lord, it was only sport for our guests, I didn't mean. I didn't ask what you meant. I came down off the dais steps, aware of every eye in the hall swinging between the girl and me, aware that I had no ready explanation for why the alpha king of the Salt Coast Pax was crossing his own feast hall for a scullery girl's unfinished work song. I didn't have one to give them. I only knew that something in me that had been clenched for 9 days had opened its hand, and I was not going to let Corin close it again out of embarrassment for his joke. Wren looked at me the way a person looks at a wolf that has come too near the fire, not frightened exactly, measuring. My lord, she said, careful, it's only a hauling song. There isn't more to it that's worth your hearing. There's more to it than you know, I said, and heard how strange that sounded even as I said it. I lowered my voice, meant only for her, though half the hall could probably still hear. Finish it. Please. She looked past me once, toward Corin, who had gone the color of old tallow, and toward the Greymore table, where the mockery had curdled into something closer to unease, men who'd laughed at a joke that had suddenly, visibly, stopped being one. Then she looked back at me, and something in her jaw set the way I'd learned, over the following days, it always set when she had decided something and would not be argued out of it. She sang. Not softer this time, not smaller for the audience. If anything, her voice opened the way it hadn't when she'd been performing for men who wanted to laugh. The third verse of a coast hauling song is the caller's verse, the one that names the boats gone out and asks the water to bring them home, and she sang it looking not at me and not at Corin, but somewhere past the shuttered window, toward the sea she couldn't see and plainly didn't need to. My mark had gone from quiet to something warmer, something almost like the first sun after a hard winter, spreading slow under my collarbone while she sang the boats home. When she finished, the hall didn't applaud. Nobody quite knew whether they were allowed to. I did know, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with 9 sleepless nights suddenly, finally, easing, exactly what I was looking at. Where did you learn that? I asked her, though I already half knew the answer wasn't going to be simple. My mother taught me, she said, and her mother taught her. It's only a hauling song, my lord. Every coast family has one. Not like that one, I said. Not one that quiets 9 nights of sea wolves through stone walls. I watched the words land on her the way they'd landed on me, not as flattery, which she plainly had no use for, but as a fact she hadn't been given before and didn't know what to do with. Her eyes went, for just a moment, toward the window, toward the sound outside that had gone from a ragged, worried howl to something low and settled, and I saw her understand. Faster than I had any right to expect from someone Corin had spent 6 years training to expect nothing from this hall, that she had just done something none of the rest of us could name. Corin tried, of course, to make it small again. He always would. That was the shape of the man, and I'd learn later exactly how long a shape it was, how many years he'd spent making sure the girl in his kitchens never learned what she carried, for reasons that had nothing to do with kindness, and everything to do with the coin a Tidekin's bloodline was worth to men who knew how to sell it. That first night, though, all he managed was a stammered apology to Lord Hale for the disruption, and an attempt to steer Wren back toward the kitchens with a hand at her elbow that she stepped neatly out of reach of, without seeming to notice she'd done it. She stays, I said. Corin, she eats at my table tonight. I watched that land on the hall harder than the song had. A scullery girl at the high table was not a small thing to ask of men who had spent their whole lives inside the shape of who belonged where. But no one argued with me, because by then the whole hall had heard what I'd heard through the walls, or near enough. The sea wolves gone quiet for the first time in 9 days. And even men who didn't carry the mark understood that something had shifted in the room that outranked the ordinary rules of a harvest feast. Wren sat 2 seats down from me, straight-backed, not eating much, watching the hall the way a person watches a room they've learned isn't safe to relax in. I didn't press her. I'd spent enough of my life being watched that way myself, In the early years after my father died and half the coast lords were deciding whether a young, unproven alpha king was worth their loyalty, to know that pressing only closes a person tighter. Your mother, I said instead, quietly, under the noise of the hall finding its feet again. Was she from the hold? Died when I was 9, fever, the year the fishing failed. She said it without asking for softness around it, a fact laid down flat. She used to say we were tidekin. I thought it was a story she told to make scrubbing floors feel like it meant something. It isn't a story. So I gathered. A ghost of dry humor crossed her face, gone as fast as it came. You'll forgive me if I don't know what to do with that, my lord. This morning I was nobody's business but Corin's. Tonight the king of the coast is asking me about my dead mother over salt cod. I liked her immediately for that, for refusing to let the strangeness of the evening turn into either fear or flattery, for handing it back to me exactly as odd as it was. The tidekin, I said, were the coast's oldest bloodline, older than the Ashvilles. Before my family carried the storm mark, the tidekin were the ones who kept the sea wolves settled, who sang the boats home, who could feel a wrong tide coming before any hunter could smell it. My grandfather's histories say the line went quiet 3 generations back, a wasting sickness, a bad winter, no one certain which. He wrote that it grieved him more than losing half his hunters, because a coast without a tidekin voice is a coast that has to weather every storm blind. And you think I'm what, the last of it? I think your song quieted 9 nights of restless wolves through 2 feet of stone, and stilled a mark on my own body that hasn't gone quiet since I was crowned. I said it plainly, because she'd earned plain over flourish in the first 10 minutes of knowing her. I don't think it, I felt it. She was quiet for a while, turning a piece of bread over without eating it. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped the careful flatness she'd been keeping since the dais. Corin knew, she said slowly, working it out as she said it, didn't he? 6 years he's had me scrubbing his floors and eating scraps, and he put me up there tonight to be laughed at in front of Graymore men, and he's known this whole time what my mother's name meant. I didn't answer that, because I didn't know it for certain yet, and because I watched her face do something in that moment that I recognized, the particular stillness of a person deciding not to let herself feel the full size of a betrayal until she had somewhere safe to put it down. I only said, I intend to find out exactly what he's known, and for how long, and meant it in a way that made Corin, 3 seats off and pretending not to listen, go very carefully back to his own plate. The storm broke 2 nights later, the worst the coast had seen in a decade, and it broke clean, hard, fast, gone by dawn, none of the grinding, days-long dread that had been building before Wren sang. My huntmaster stood on the cliff path afterward, turning his cap over in his hands, staring at driftwood scattered thick along the tide line where whole boats should have been lost, and said only, "Never seen a big one pass through so clean, my lord. Never in 30 years." I hadn't told him why. I wanted, selfishly, one more day of it being only mine and Wren's to understand before the whole hold turned her into a story. I found her on the cliff path that morning, not singing, just standing with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the sea wolves work the tide line below, thin, sleek shapes moving easy and unhurried through the rack, the first easy morning they'd had in 10 days. She didn't turn when I came up beside her, though I know she heard me. Nothing about her carried the startled deference of a scullery girl anymore, not since 2 nights ago, though she hadn't yet found whatever new shape she was going to stand in instead. "Corin's gone," I told her. "I had him brought before me last night after you'd gone to bed. He didn't deny knowing your mother's name or what it meant. He said he judged it kinder to keep you ignorant, that a tidekin girl who knew her own worth would only have been taken from the hold by some lord with deeper pockets than mine, the way it happened to your grandmother's sister, 2 coasts north, 40 years back. He said he was protecting you by keeping you small, by keeping me scrubbing his floors and eating what the dogs wouldn't." I told him there's a considerable distance between protecting someone and simply using them cheap while telling yourself it's protection. He's on the road south this morning. He won't return to Ashcombe. She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer at all. Then, 6 years, she said, not to me exactly, more to the water. 6 years I told myself it was only bad luck being born to nobody in a hall that didn't want me. And it was a man's choice the whole time. That's a harder thing to sit with than bad luck somehow. Bad luck you can just survive. A choice you have to decide what to do with. You don't have to decide today. No, she looked at me sideways then, and there was something wry in it, something that told me she'd already started finding her new shape, faster than I had any right to expect. But you're going to ask me something today anyway, aren't you, my lord? I can feel it coming the way I used to feel Corin coming with a chore nobody else wanted. I laughed, the first real laugh I think I'd managed in 9 anxious nights, and it startled a smaller answering smile out of her, quick and unpracticed, like a muscle she hadn't used in a while. I want you to stay, I said. Not in the kitchens. Ashcombe hasn't had a Tidekin voice in 3 generations, and I felt what your voice did to a storm that should have taken half my coast. That's not a small thing to offer a king, and I won't pretend I don't want it for the hold's sake. But that isn't the whole of what I'm asking, and I think you already know it isn't. Say the rest, then. I'd rather have it plain. My storm mark has burned every day of my life since I was crowned, low and constant, the way it's meant to. A king feels his coast's temper in his own skin. That's the old bargain the Ashvilles made. It went quiet the moment you sang. Not just settled, quiet, entirely, for the first time in 11 years. I don't think that's a coincidence of timing, Wren. I think it's the bond the old histories talk about, the one between a storm-marked king and a Tidekin voice, that hasn't existed on this coast in 3 generations because there hasn't been a Tidekin to carry it. I made myself say the last of it plainly, no dressing on it. I'm not asking you to be grateful for a title. I'm telling you what I felt, and asking whether you felt anything answering it. She didn't look away from the water for a long moment, and when she finally spoke her voice had none of the wry deflection she'd been using to hold the last 2 days at arm's length. When I sang that first verse, she said, slow, like she was working out the true shape of something she'd only felt sideways until now, I wasn't thinking about the hall or Corin or the Greymore men laughing. I was thinking, this is strange, but it's true, I was thinking about you. Not because I knew you, my lord, I didn't. I'd served your table 100 times and you'd never once looked at me long enough to remember my face. I don't know why my mind went to you. But it did, and the song came easier than it's ever come. And I told myself after that it was only nerves making things feel large that weren't. It wasn't nerves. No, she agreed, quiet. I don't think it was. I won't pretend the whole coast bent easy to a scullery girl becoming Tidekin to their king. Lord Hale's men rode home with a story that grew taller with every telling, and there were hunters in my own hold who muttered, in the first weeks, that a kitchen girl's voice was a strange foundation to build the coast's safety on, whatever histories said about bloodlines gone quiet 3 generations back. Wren bore it the way she bore most things, with a level, unimpressed patience that outlasted the mutterers faster than any royal decree could have. What changed the muttering in the end wasn't my word for her. It was the second storm, a fortnight later, smaller than the first but ugly enough that half my hunters expected losses on the tide line. She stood on the cliff path in the driving rain with her hood down, singing the caller's verse into wind that should have torn the sound to nothing before it reached the water, and the sea wolves below answered her note for note, and the boats came home whole, every one. And the hunters who'd muttered about kitchen girls stood on that cliff afterward with their caps in their hands and didn't mutter anything at all. I stood beside her through it, close enough to feel the warmth spreading under my collarbone where the mark had gone, for the second time in my life, entirely quiet, not the temporary quiet of a storm past, but a settled, permanent quiet, The coast's old temper finally answered the way it was always meant to be. When the last boat rounded the point safe, she let the song go and swayed, suddenly, with the particular exhaustion of a person who has just spent everything she had, and I caught her before she'd finished swaying, an arm around her that she let herself lean into without argument, which from Wren was its own kind of answer. "Twice now," I said, into the rain-soaked quiet after. "You've kept my coast standing twice, and asked nothing for it either time." "I'm not doing it for payment, my lord." "I know that's rather the trouble." I felt her laugh, tired and real, against my shoulder. "I'd like to give you something anyway, not payment. A place that's actually yours, not Corin's kitchen, not sufferance at my table because it would be strange to seat you anywhere else. Yours." "And what would that look like exactly?" I could have made it a grander speech than I did. I'd had 2 weeks to think about how to say it, watching her find her feet in a hold that had spent 6 years telling her she belonged nowhere in it, watching the quiet under my collarbone stay quiet every single day she was near enough for me to feel it. But standing on that cliff path soaked through with rain and relief, the grand version felt like exactly the wrong shape for a woman who told me from the first night she'd rather have things plain. "It would look like Lunar of the Salt Coast," I said, "if you wanted it. Not because the histories say a king owes his tidekin a crown, though they do say that. Because I've spent 2 weeks watching you decide, one plain, unimpressed decision at a time, exactly who you mean to be now that no one's telling you who you're allowed to be. And I would like, very much, to spend the rest of my life beside whoever that turns out to become." She was quiet long enough that the rain had time to ease before she answered, and when she did, it wasn't the wry deflection I'd half expected, and it wasn't a grand answer either. It was just Wren, plain as ever, looking up at me with the particular steadiness of someone who has finally been asked instead of assigned. "I scrubbed this hold's floors for 6 years thinking I was nobody's business," she said. "I'd like to spend a good deal longer than that being somebody's whole reason for standing on a cliff in the rain. So yes, plainly, yes." We were married at the turn of winter, in the great hall where Corin had once put her up on a dais to be laughed at, though there was little enough left of that old shape by then. No lord came from Graymore, and none was missed. The hunters who'd muttered about kitchen girls stood along the walls and did not mutter, and when Wren sang the closing verse of the old hauling song, not commanded to it this time, but choosing it deliberately, because she said the coast ought to hear how the story actually ended, every sea wolf on the tide line answered her through the open hall doors, low and easy and entirely unafraid, the sound of a coast that had finally, after 3 quiet generations, gotten its voice back. My storm mark has not burned once, not for a single day, since the night she finished that first verse instead of being sent back to the kitchens. I still catch myself, sometimes, reaching for my collar out of 11 years old habit, and finding nothing there but quiet and Wren, close enough to notice and close enough to smile.